Hello and welcome to today's webinar. Just give it another moment for folks to get logged in for the session today. Just a few housekeeping announcements before we get started. You will be muted during this presentation. If you'd like to ask a question, please enter it into the Q&A box, and we'll save time at the end of the presentation to address as many questions as possible. This presentation is being recorded and will be made available on the CA Labor Lab and Center for Occupational and Environmental Health YouTube page. And all participants who logged in with their registration email for the full live presentation today will receive an email tomorrow with a link to the evaluation form that will qualify you for a certificate of completion worth 1 continuing education contact hour. And once you've finished that evaluation, you'll be able to access and print your certificate. Thank you so much for being here. And with that, I will turn it over to Dr. Yellen.
Hi, and Michelle, if you could put my slides on. Right, there's just a disclaimer for NIOSH that we use the term total worker health. What our center is one of their centers. It's registered to them. Next, please. The only thing we have to disclose is the funding from NIOSH for our total worker health program, the California Labor Lab, the logo you see on your bottom left. So the mission of the California Labor Laboratory is to extend the pursuit of health and safety for workers in traditional employment to those in a wide range of alternative arrangements. And we do this in partnerships with the affected communities of workers. Next. Want to alert you to the next 2 of our monthly webinars. The next one is a little change of pace. Annie McClanahan is a professor of English at UC Irvine, who has written extensively on the rhetoric that underlies the transition to gig form and other forms of work. And looking forward to that. And the webinar after that is by our very own Director of Research, Carissa Harris, who, as you know, directs the ergonomics program at the Center for Occupational and Environmental Health on the 3 campus consortium. And she will be talking about home office ergonomics, which is highly relevant to the mission of our center and to most of us who spend some time working at home. Next. And with that, I will introduce Dr. Paul Blanc, whom I've known since 1985 and really honored to have collaborated with him on some of his path-breaking work in 2 distinct but related spheres. I'll start by Paul entered occupational health when he was mentored by and one of the really fathers of our field at Goddard College, John Freunds, who sadly just passed away. Paul then got a master's in public health at Harvard, his medical degree in Einstein, which I think for him is well named as his college. Did his medical training at Cook County, where he was an intern resident, and then was a clinical scholar here when I first met him at the combined UCSF and Stanford program. Paul is well known for his work in the epidemiology of respiratory and musculoskeletal conditions, toxicology. He's done a lot of work on surveillance methods, and all that is under his hat as the long-term director of the Division of Occupational Environmental Health here at UCSF. But he wears another hat as one of the foremost historians of occupational health. In fact, he has a joint appointment in the history department here at UCSF. So I am honored that he is going to address those 2 related fields in his talk today. Paul?
Thank you. So I'm very happy to be here, and I just want to confirm that everybody can see the title slide. Good. Past is prologue, how the history of occupational illness and injury teaches us about where we are today. So the how in the title is deliberate. It's not exactly so much as what, but the what is there, but also what is the process by which we can learn from history so that when we look at other historical events, we can see more. I have nothing to disclose. So let me go on to the specific goals. As I indicated, it's not simply to ask what history teaches us, but how it teaches us so that we can gain insights from that how and become more alert to the warning signs of newly emerging novel hazards. And I would put in that newly emerging ways of working and working relationships and re-emerging long established hazards as well. So it's not just the new, it's the return of the old. And I'm going to start off with a few case histories and then the historical background to those case histories. So let's take the first example, a 26-year-old male who presents with fevers, chills, malaise, and a drenching night sweat. Began around bedtime the night before. He presents, but he feels a little better this morning. He works as a welder, and he's done so for 5 years, doing both simple stick and MIG and TIG gas shielded jobs, usually on mild steel. But yesterday morning, he worked several hours on a galvanized job, that is to say, steel coated with zinc. And the foreman chuckled when he assigned him the work, telling him to drink plenty of milk at lunch. Here's an example of this kind of work on galvanized steel. And those of us with clinical backgrounds in occupational health can immediately recognize this as a classic presentation of what is known as metal fume fever. And that's all very good, but what is the history of this? What is the history of welding, for example? Well, electric arc welding has not always been with us. It was once a very novel technology invented by this man in 1888. And it's what made possible the metal fume fever in the previous scenario, because the thin zinc coating on the metal vaporizes when it's welded and gives off a huge amount of zinc oxide fume. But the earlier history of metal fume fever is even more revealing to my mind as to how changing technology leads to changing patterns of disease. Brass foundry work was the first recognized cause of metal fume fever. Brass is an alloy of copper and zinc, and brass foundries not only pour the castings, but they actually make the alloy at the time that they pour the castings. And this is the first printed recognition of metal fume fever. It appeared in an 1832 seminal text by Charles Turner Thacker, a British physician, and he noted in that book, the brass founders suffer from the inhalation of volatilized metal. In the founding of yellow brass, in particular, the evolution of oxide of zinc is very great. The brass smelters of Birmingham state their liability also to an intermittent fever, which they term the brass ague, which attacks them from once a month to once a year and leaves them in a state of great debility. Interesting, this textbook was the second version, the second edition of Thacker's text. The first appeared in 1831 and didn't have a word to say about this condition because it was in the interim that he visited or heard about the brass foundries in Birmingham. He was based in a different city in England, in Sheffield, in Leeds, I'm sorry. Interesting that brass founding related metal fume fever should only be reported in the 1830s because brass has been made since antiquity. Here's a Renaissance image of a brass founding operation. And so why is it that it was only a new disease in 1831? It's because until the 18th century, brass always had been made by slowly heating together copper and a source of zinc, a zinc mineral, typically zinc carbonate. This brass technically had a lower content of zinc than later brass, and thus it wasn't the yellow brass that Thacker was referring to in his first observation. It was not quite as yellow, not as golden, perhaps not as desirable. And the reason why this method was used is because metallic zinc as such was unknown in Europe until the 18th century. In fact, the refining of zinc as a metal is a technology that comes to us from Asia. Here's a 1637 Asian text, which shows an image of the process that was used at that time to refine metallic zinc. And it was only until 1738 that the first European patent for the industrial distillation of metallic zinc was taken out. That was in England. So what did this mean in practice? Zinc melts at the temperature of 419 degrees Celsius. At 930 degrees Celsius, it actually boils. Well, that's a lower temperature than the temperature at which copper melts, which is more than 1,000 degrees. In the old process with the zinc carbonate slowly heated, the zinc was off-gassed, joining with the copper to form an alloy slowly. But in the new yellow brass founding, the way it was done was that pure ingots of the metallic zinc that was suddenly available were dropped into melted copper. And of course, the zinc boiled at this temperature and large amounts of zinc fume was thrown off. And thus we had this new disease. There are other technologies that also cause inhalation fever because it is not only metallic zinc that can cause this. In fact, it is more commonly caused by work practices which generate a lot of bacterial debris. So in 1831, there was a new industry that emerged in England of machines that were grinding up rags, and these were cotton rags, and a new disease was associated with it called shoddy fever. In 1941, a century later, there was an outbreak of cotton fever in a new industry that was for the war effort, in which old stained, which is contaminated or bacterial overgrowth contaminated cotton mattresses were taken apart, and a large outbreak of the disease occurred. A decade later was the first report of fluoropolymers causing a fume fever syndrome when they were heated. Of course, fluoropolymers were a relatively new industrial chemical after World War II. And then finally, in 1978, the first outbreak of what came to be called Pontiac fever was reported, which was the contamination in an office environment through the HVAC system of bacterially contaminated air. In this case, it was dead Legionella, but Pontiac fever is not actually Legionnaire's disease. It's the immune response to dead bacteria. This was in a governmental office, not in an auto plant, even though it was in Michigan. So I'm going to leave fume fever and go on to a second condition. In this case, we have a 40-year-old female who presents with progressive shortness of breath, also weight loss, and a CAT scan shows nodular and ground glass changes, which are consistent with an interstitial lung process, quite concerning. And she has a test for fungal precipitants, a blood test, which is positive, showing that she's having an immune response to a specific fungus. She had had a history, an environmental history of a pipe that burst in her bedroom wall last spring with the thaw. The insurance company brought in fans to remediate it. She hasn't felt well since then. So from those of us with the clinical background can immediately recognize this as a classic presentation of what's called hypersensitivity pneumonitis. Outside the United States and Great Britain, it's known as extrinsic allergic alveolitis, but it's the same name, a different name for the same condition. Now, talking about mold contamination in the home doesn't really raise the specter of a technology causing or making possible a disease, but in fact, this is exactly an example of another technological change. The picture here is of something that was patented just before World War I. You can see the 1912 patent date there, and that is drywall. Drywall has that long a history, but really became dominant in construction in the period of rapid domestic construction after World War II. What is drywall? It's not a natural product. It's manufactured by sandwiching gypsum between paperboard. The old-fashioned way of doing walls, lath and plaster, was not very conducive to mold growth, but the cellulose-based drywall is really an ideal medium for mold growth. So it's not surprising that in the modern era, this new technology has made possible a chronic mold infestation, and one of the most concrete pathologies associated with that is, in fact, hypersensitivity pneumonitis, as in the case I presented. But if so, if mold and bacteria can cause this condition, why is this a modern disease? After all, such exposures in the agricultural sector go back to since humans started working in agriculture. So this is the bulk of recorded human history. And in fact, there is a hypersensitivity pneumonitis that is associated with agriculture. It's known as farmer's lung, but even that was only reported first in the 1930s. Why would that be? Well, I'm just showing you one of the first case reports. It was from 1932, and it was of what was misdiagnosed at the time as asthma, but later became apparent that this was the same condition I'm speaking about. And the author notes that in the past year, our interest has been attracted to this field because we have had occasion to examine a comparatively large group of men presenting asthmatic symptoms in whom we think that we have quite definitely established a fungus spore as the etiologic factor, apparently as a sensitizing agent rather than as a parasitic infection. And the key thing they point out is that there's an economic condition that led to this, which is that the railway tie factory that these people were working in did not operate during the winter months of 1930 and 31 because of the Great Depression, and the operation was resumed in 31, and these railroad ties that have been sitting outside and unused were heavily mold contaminated. So the other technology that changed here is a diagnostic one. So sometimes the changing technologies that lead to disease are in the exposure side, but sometimes it's a new diagnostic modality that lets us see the disease that was probably already there. And in this case, it's radiology, because without a chest X-ray, it's difficult to appreciate that this condition is present. And I just show you the explosion in the number of radiologists practicing in the United States in the first decades of the 20th century, and how that probably made this possible. And a second technology is the laboratory diagnostic technique of measuring precipitating antibodies, which was only first reported in the 1960s. And in fact, if you look at the medical literature, since then, there's been a proliferation of reports of hypersensitivity pneumonitis in a variety of occupational and environmental scenarios. There are also other technological changes which have introduced new sources of extrinsic allergic alveolitis. In 1916, the modern swamp cooler was introduced. I don't know how many of the listeners are familiar with swamp coolers, but they're a kind of early air conditioner in which water is dripped over straw and air is blown through it. And these later became a notable source, and still are in some areas, especially the Southwest, of hypersensitivity pneumonitis. In 1922, a new process was developed where sugarcane debris could be reprocessed and turned into insulating board, not the same as drywall, but somewhat similar. And that was followed soon thereafter by a large outbreak of hypersensitivity pneumonitis in those workers. In 1954, the technology of polyurethane foam was first introduced. And later on, it turned out that this chemical, still through a mechanism that's not well understood, can create the same kind of lung response. And finally, in the 1960s, instead of mineral oil coolants in a machine metalworking operations, new synthetic, wholly synthetic forms of metal cooling fluids were introduced. And it turns out that although bacteria didn't like to grow over in traditional metalworking, metal cooling fluids, they just love synthetic fluids. And so a new industrial source of this condition was born. Now, the third example I want to share with you is that of a 60-year-old male who presents with a pin rolling tremor, rigidity, a wide-based propulsive gait. And as the disease progresses, he develops mask-like facies and loses his expression. From a clinical point of view, this can be recognized as a classic presentation of Parkinson's disease. Or is it better called Parkinsonism? That is a Parkinsonian syndrome, which is not idiopathic, but which is due to an external factor. So we get some additional history, and this patient had worked for over 30 years as a welder and had routinely used high manganese content welding rods in his operation. So it circles back in a way to the first case I presented occupationally. But in fact, this of course is another example of a changing technology, not from the very beginning of welding, but in the 1930s when manganese in welding rods was introduced. At the very same time, manganese began to be used in battery manufacturing. And in fact, in the very same year, there were two separate articles, completely unrelated, although both were in German, of workers with Parkinson's type disease who had exposure to manganese, 2 from welding and 3 from manufacturing manganese batteries. But in fact, neither electric arc welding nor manganese batteries were the first technological changes that led to toxicity from manganese or manganism. And the first outbreak was noted in 1828 when a previously healthy young man had been grinding manganese and developed progressive weakness of the lower extremities. In a year following, another grinder presented with weakness and an inclination to run forward when he attempts to walk, in other words, propulsive gait, poor speaking, poor phonation, and an obvious expression of vacancy in the countenance, that is, mask-like expression. Over the ensuing 7 years, 3 other cases were noted by the same physician, always with a staggering gait, but they, if removed early from continuing exposure, had some resolution of their symptoms. Here's the initial report. In the chemical works of Charles Tennant, a considerable number of men are employed in the grinding of black oxide of manganese to be employed in the manufacturing of a new commercial product, bleaching powder. The surface of their bodies is, of course, constantly covered with manganese, and the air they breathe is loaded with it in the form of a fine powder, and they are ever exposed from neglect of cleanliness to swallow portions of it along with their food. We know now that it's really the inhalation that matters, not the ingestion, but nonetheless, this was an astute observation of an exposure and an effect. Here's the timeline of what used to be called the shaking palsy and that we call today Parkinsonism. In fact, Edmund Spencer referred to something like this in The Fairy Queen, but it was John Parkinson, after whom the disease is named, that first described 3 cases he had treated in 1817. The report of the manganese workers is only 20 years after that, and the disease didn't come to be called Parkinson's disease until the latter part of the 19th century, when Charcot, the French neurologist, coined the term the malady of Parkinson, and talked about a man attacked by Parkinson's disease in consequence of strong emotion occasioned by the attempts of the Federalists during the Commune to incorporate him into the battalions, to their battalions. So of course, Charcot was Mr. Hysteria, that was his disease. But in this case, he's describing it in a male and not in a female, which was unusual for him. We don't know if the Russians are going to see a lot of this in the people they try to drag to the Ukraine. Was this the only technology, bleaching powder, that led to exposure to manganese in the 19th and 20th centuries, aside from the welding I already mentioned? Well, no, not at all. A man named Parsons invented something called manganese bronze in the 1870s, and really very shortly thereafter, another inventor brought high manganese steel onto the scene. In 1900, a new process was developed that allowed the separation of zinc, taking it out of zinc manganese ore, which wasn't really very useful as a mix, and it was associated with a large US outbreak of disease. In 1848, manganese toxicity was documented in those that manufactured manganese electrodes, not just those welding. In 1988, a new agricultural chemical called Maneb, which contained manganese, was introduced and associated with disease. And then at the beginning of our century, welding was really rediscovered as a cause of manganism. It had really been ignored since those first reports in the 1930s. The most recent outbreak, I don't know if this is technology or not, but there was a process for manufacturing illicit drugs that took an over-the-counter medication and treated it with potassium permanganate, and you could create a kind of stimulant, and it was injected intravenously, which is an excellent way of introducing manganese into the body. And there was an outbreak of disease reported. This was in the former USSR. Here are just some illustrations from a US governmental report from 1940 on an outbreak of manganism with Parkinson's features, just underscoring that this was not an obscure disease to people working in the field of occupational medicine. And meanwhile, of course, manganese is as big as ever. This map shows the world's biggest producers, which include China, India, and some of the Central Asian republics and a few other countries, of course, South Africa and Brazil. So how can we think about this beyond these three examples, even if each of them has buried within it multiple sources of technological change and technologically related exposure? So I wanted to show a selection of technologies that were introduced in the 19th century that led to either occupational or environmental disease. One of them was cobalt ore mining. It turned out that cobalt ore naturally is associated with uranium. And even before anybody knew what uranium was, when people mined cobalt ore, the exposure to radon caused lung cancer. Now, strictly speaking, the first observation of this was even in the century before this, but that was an obscure observation, and it wasn't really clear that it was lung cancer. Lung cancer before tobacco smoking was an extremely rare malignancy. But in the 19th century, a large outbreak was noted in the area where cobalt mining occurred in the Harz Mountains of Germany. Rabbit fur felt making. Now that may not sound like a high-level technology, but in fact, all of you will know the aphorism about mad as a hatter and the use of mercury in the felt industry. But in fact, the original felt industry used beavers to make beaver pelts to make felt. And when you use beaver to make felt for high-class hats at the time, you don't need any mercury at all. But when we hunted the beavers in Canada, the main source, almost to extinction, suddenly they had to find an alternative. And it turned out that rabbit pelts, if you treat it with mercury, yields something which is passable for felt. And that's when mercury exposure in hat makers became a real disease. Benzidine dyes were only introduced in the 19th century as a product of the new chemistry, the new industrial chemistry. And not very long after, basically as long as it takes to have a lag time for cancer, which is about 10 to 15 years or 20, outbreaks of bladder cancer began to be noticed in benzidine dye manufacturing workers. So that's truly a new cause to a disease that existed before, but never in that way. The vulcanization of rubber, which needs to happen to turn useless latex into what we think of as rubber, can be done by several processes, but one process that was introduced that did not require heat was using a chemical called carbon disulfide. This was introduced in the middle of the 19th century, and very quickly thereafter, outbreaks of psychosis, going crazy, was noted in the workers exposed to this chemical at very high levels. This was mostly in factories in France. Instant strike matches, not what we call safety matches, these were unsafety matches, led to an outbreak of something called phosphorus necrosis or phossy jaw, disfiguring and fatal disease among the workers exposed to the phosphorus fumes. Air compression underwater causes something called caisson disease, and caisson disease killed a number of workers who built the Brooklyn Bridge and other major bridges around the world in the 19th century into the 20th. Benzene had not been a chemical widely available until the 19th century. It's extracted from coal and as a byproduct of making coal gas. And its use to dissolve rubber and make glue led to a new disease towards the very end of the 19th century, aplastic anemia in glue workers. And probably the last disease of the 19th century caused by new process was the electrolytic production of chlorine gas, and that led to chloracne in the workers. It was first noted in 1899. We can go through the same exercise with the 20th century. And here, some of our new wonderful inventions include pneumatic drilling, which led to a wide outbreak of silicosis in mines and quarries because the dust was being generated so efficiently. So that's an example of an old disease with a rebirth from this technology. Asbestos had never really been used commercially. Its introduction in the early in the 20th century led to mesothelioma being detected not very long after. Carbon disulfide, the chemical I mentioned in the 19th century, was reintroduced in the 20th in the manufacturing of viscose rayon, the first widely produced synthetic textile. And it caused insanity just like in the 19th century, but only later on in the 20th century with modern epidemiologic techniques did it also become clear that it caused accelerated atherosclerosis and heart attacks in the workers in that industry at frighteningly young ages. Methyl mercury, as opposed to the inorganic mercury in the hat industry, was introduced as an agricultural chemical and was associated with outbreaks of organic mercury poisoning in the 20th. That's a syndrome which is actually worse, if anything, than standard mercury poisoning. Organophosphate pesticides were also introduced in the 20th century, and really largely speaking after World War II, and some of them became associated with chronic neurotoxicity. Benzene was removed from glues, but instead a chemical called hexane was introduced, and in the 20th century, and actually in the 1960s, was recognized to be associated with polyneuropathy, that is to say the damage to a variety of nerves of sensation and of motor function. Epoxy glues, epoxy polymers were introduced also after World War II and were associated with asthma and with hemorrhage of the lung in certain rare cases. Polyvinyl chloride was really the first modern example of an outbreak of occupational cancer in workers in plastic factories where this polymerization occurred, and it was associated with angiosarcoma of the liver, first noted in 1973. And now in our own years, in the 21st century, basically, there's been yet another outbreak of silicosis, this in people working with a new product. Some of you may have it in your kitchens or bathrooms, Caesar stone or Silas stone synthetic quartz countertops. And finally, also in terms of new technologies, Indian tin oxide is a substance used in thin display sets like TV displays. And the workers that make that have suffered from a otherwise rare but quite deadly disease called pulmonary alveolar proteinosis. By the way, some of the synthetic stone workers have the same problem, as it turns out. Now, I've been speaking about illness, but I want to say a few things about physical injury as well. These are just some examples of technologies in the 19th and 20th century associated with specific syndromes of traumatic injury. One of them, again, some of these are very low-tech technologies, but the introduction of steel pen nibs instead of quills is really the factor that led to overuse disability of the hands called scrivener's palsy at the time. Power tools their introduction led to something called white finger vibration syndrome from the vibration of those tools. Pneumatic spray painting is the source of a type of injury called high pressure injection injury, where people inject by accident substances into usually their non-dominant hand when they're cleaning the spray gun. And it can lead to, in severe cases, amputation of the limb or the hand. In the 19th century, the use of link and pin rail couplers was the source of an epidemic of traumatic fatalities in railway workers. Okay, here's another low-tech tech. It's wall-to-wall carpeting. Wall-to-wall carpeting is really a post-war housing technique, but it's a great way to cause what's called carpet layers need because of the work practice that's involved. The use of power augers and power takeoffs in agriculture has led to a flurry of amputations in farm workers. The family farm is no longer such a safe place to work. And one other example I want to give you, I don't know how many of you have ever rented a power gun at a Ace or some other hardware store, but you don't get any training if you rent it, and you can puncture all sorts of sites by misfiring. But one of the high profile injuries that you'll see described in the medical literature is putting a nail from a nail gun into your heart. And that, of course, is a pretty serious injury. I don't want to be all Mr. Doom and Gloom. So here are some examples of technological fixes. Technology which actually has decreased occupational injury and illness. The simplest and oldest one is providing a source of vitamin C to sailors to prevent scurvy. Scurvy, of course, was a terrible occupational disease up until and even following the discovery of the cause of scurvy, because in fact, even though the British Navy and other navies introduced sources of vitamin C, wasn't known as vitamin C at the time, to sailors in the merchant marine and private navies, this was not introduced for another 100 years. And so this condition remained endemic. Also, many of you are familiar with the association between chimney sweeping and cancer of the scrotum in the underage workers who performed that work, because underage because they could be small enough to crawl up the chimneys. And in fact, there was a lot of agitation and work to develop mechanized forms of chimney sweeping, which is how it's done now, that eliminated that disease. Safety matches replace the instant strike matches, and that form of phosphorus does not cause Foss and jaw. A train coupling device that replaced the one I had alluded to, the Janey train coupler was called in the 19th century, greatly reduced fatalities in train workers. The use of magnesium silicate instead of silica containing sand in sandblasting can eliminate silicosis in sandblasters. In fact, in Europe, silica can't be used in sandblasting, but in the United States, it's still legal. Using aluminum or even plastic car radiators reduces lead poisoning in radiator workers. And here's a high-tech one, providing some shade for farm workers to eliminate or reduce the risk of heat stroke, along with other administrative controls. And finally, just to bring it into our own time, thinking about vaccination and N95 masks to reduce the occupational risk of COVID in workers, not just healthcare workers, but also, of course, in other industries where this has been a big problem, such as meat processing workers or prison workers. So before I open it up for questions, I just also want to take a few minutes to say something about some of the personalities that have helped us with the transmitted wisdom without which we can't even appreciate what this history is or was or might be, and how we can, what the how of it. So part of the how of history are these leaders who devoted their lives to this field and made, through observation and epidemiology, made really major contributions. So going clockwise, first I show you Alice Hamilton. Many of you have participated in our annual Alice Hamilton lecture on occupational disease. She was the founder of occupational medicine in this country, really, and was the first woman on the faculty of Harvard, and a very seminal figure. The second one is Archie Cochrane, who many of you may know the name from the Cochrane collaboration that looks at the effectiveness of various treatments on diseases. But Archie Cochrane started off as a coal mine doctor in England, and also was a physician with the International Brigade in Spain. Ludwig Teleke was a leading figure in occupational medicine in Central Europe, and then had to flee to the United States during the war. Heiermans was a leader of occupational medicine in the Netherlands, and I show just one of the many occupational medicine figures from the former Soviet Union, very important in the history of the disease. Many of them suffered the various ups and downs of repression in that country. And then finally, Guy Hauser, a physician, a progressive from France, who was quite important in the 1930s, and then was murdered during the war. So I just wanted to take those minutes to give a nod to those people. And there are many more out there. So with that, I'll open it up, Ed, to questions.
Great. And can everybody hear me? Good. So there are quite a few questions in the chat. I'll try and group them by themes rather than the specific things that people, I'll try and cover the specific things, but they come up as two themes. One of them is, what are the emerging technologies in work that you and occupational medicine colleagues are actively surveilling now to try and prevent these mass epidemics of occupational diseases from former technologies, those in the 18th through the early 21st century? What are the things that you're watching and surveilling?
Well, unfortunately, a lot of the surveillance is for secondary and tertiary prevention. So these are, you detect people who already do have evidence of disease, and hopefully you reduce their exposure so that it doesn't continue to worsen, or doesn't worsen as quickly as it would otherwise. And the example that I gave of the recent outbreak of terrible lung disease from synthetic quartz stone use is a great example of that. The California State Health Department has been active in that. Unfortunately, these people work in small shops, if you want to talk about different kinds of work situations, and they are often the most heavily exposed, the least likely to be unionized, often with poor documentation as well. So that's one example I would give.
So another question from one of our the people who've attended your webinar today, Paul, is said, thanks for the info. This is a loaded question, but what should be done in ventilation standards nationwide or with personal protection equipment to protect workers from the infections and chemicals that you spoke about today for certain or all occupational industries?
Well, ventilation and personal protective equipment, of course, is the lowest down on the hierarchy of controls, the first thing you want to do whenever you can is either remove the exposure altogether or substitute a different process so that the amount is not produced. It is true that in welding, additional ventilation is often a key thing because it's very difficult to have a technological fix for the production of welding fume when you weld.
So a related question to the first one is, how can prevention ever come up with the implementation of new science and technology? Because it seems like we find an occasional case, then other cases, they're reported, other cases are reported when people read the other case studies. But the question is, I think, very germane. How can prevention ever catch up with the implementation of new science and technology?
I'm an incrementalist. I think you just have to try to do what you can do. I don't know how else to respond to it. There is a kind of cyclical amnesia that occurs in our field where an exposure is identified, the disease connection is made, there's a little bit of noise about it, and then 10 or 20 years later, it seems like it's completely forgotten, and then somebody else comes along and reports what might very well be the same thing. And in fact, that's what led me to get interested in the history of occupational environmental medicine, because in my own research projects, when I would try to write the background section on a problem, and somebody would refer to so-and-so was the first to report such and such, and then I would go and say, is that really true? And I'd go back and I'm like, no, actually, that wasn't the first person. It was 50 years before that, or it was 50 years before that, and then 25 years before that. So I think that's a really key, unfortunate aspect of the field. And so I don't know whether that's because of the economic pressures going the other way, but that could very well be a part of it.
So there are a couple of questions about specific exposures. One is, are there studies you've come across on ethyl oxide? Another one, is there any indication of new disease burden due to the engineered nanomaterials, which are relatively new technology?
Well, I think the person may mean ethylene oxide, which is a sterilizing agent. And of course, that's an example of a technology that was introduced as an alternative to other sterilizing agents with their own problems. I think that because ethylene oxide is used mostly in healthcare facilities, in that context, at least, it's a fairly closely looked at exposure with controls largely in place. In terms of nanoparticles, I guess I would cite another historical context, which would be Winston Churchill when he talked about the battle for Britain, slightly paraphrasing. One of the things I think sometimes about ultrafine particle, not air pollution, we're talking about nanoparticles in manufacturing, is that, never has so much been said about something with so little evidence. I mean, it was a very sexy topic and a lot of people keep talking about it, but I keep looking for some kind of report where we can actually see the generic effect of nanoparticles. Whereas if you take certain substances which are clearly a hazard by their own right, and you produce them in a nanoparticle way with great efficiency of exposure, obviously that's an issue, but it's not so much because they're nanoparticles, it's because of what the particles are chemically.
So a couple of comments on things you mentioned and didn't. One is, one of our colleagues was surprised that you didn't mention either diacetyl or nylon flak-induced lung disease, and I'm sure I'm mispronouncing diacetyl. or diacetyl?
Diacetyl.
Oh,
Yeah, so
there you go.
Yeah, that's another great example. Diacetyl is a chemical which is a naturally occurring chemical, but also is a synthetic chemical which has been used in the food industry to impart an artificial butter flavor, and was associated first with, or the most high profile initial outbreak was with microwave popcorn manufacturers. And that was, but looking back, there were other cases that were probably not appreciated. It causes a very rare but very bad lung disease. I think to me, the interesting part about that history, probably a different direction to go, is that despite the recognition of the association, nothing happened to remove it from the workplace until finally there was a case of disease in a consumer. And the financial legal risk to the manufacturer is far, far greater if it's a consumer third-party exposure. And overnight, it was taken out of the popcorn.
So for those of us in the California Labor Lab, one of the risks that you talked about were those in the stone fabrication industry. And we have a major project with our colleagues from the State Department of Health and UCSF looking at the health risks associated with Caesar stone and other things that are used in the kitchens and the bathrooms of the upper middle class like ourselves. So we urge you to follow the progress in this very important project from our colleagues in the California Labor Lab. I'm just now going through all the questions, and there are a lot here. Somebody is asking about OSHA's record keeping. I read the original purpose was to lead to research. Now it seems it's used to punish employers counting musculoskeletal claims. Any thoughts?
Well, I don't have any direct comment on that. I think that's an overly optimistic look at the OSHA logs. I don't know if they're used for anything.
And so another question asked Paul, praising the presentation, would you say that manganese exposure is a concern within the sweatshop industry? And if so, would it be to such a degree that it could be responsible for contributing to Parkinson's disease in a person? I ask because my mom had Parkinson's disease, which she succumbed to. Thank you.
Yeah, I don't, offhand, I wouldn't see how that manganese would be present in secondary textile manufacturing, if that's what's being described.
So at this point, we have more questions. I tried to group them, and I think you get the tone. I will say this, our California Labor Lab second annual conference is on surveillance and monitoring in contemporary work next May 2nd and 3rd. And I commend it to you because most of us think about the surveillance issues in a negative light. But when you have individual cases and small employers, say in the stone fabrication industry, it's only when surveillance methods emerge that you understand that there's an occupational etiology involved. And so many of us are rightfully concerned when the tech companies develop mechanisms to monitor our behavior at work and at home. But we also need to use some kinds of surveillance techniques to protect workers. So our conference next May will deal with some of the pluses, but also some of, and obviously the many minuses that are emerging in contemporary surveillance and monitoring in the workplace. And with that, Paul, I want to thank you for a fantastic talk. And I want to thank the 215 people approximately who attended this talk. It's a new record for the California Labor Lab, and when we hope is soon broken by the talks that Annie McClanahan is giving a month from today on the rhetoric underlying gig work, and that Carissa Harris is going to give on ergonomics and home employment. And with that, we bid you adieu and thank you very kindly for your attendance, and Paul for an excellent talk.
Thank you.